Have you ever been disturbed by strange rustlings and knocks coming from the basement in the middle of the night? Perhaps you just dismissed it all as creaking floorboards, drafts, or rats. But imagine this. While you're enjoying fresh air, sunlight, and delicious food, deep in a dark basement, prisoners have been languishing for years, locked underground by a cruel tormentor. That's exactly what the residents of the small Austrian town of Amstetten could never have imagined, that the basement of one of their homes served as a dungeon for 4 people over 24 agonizing years. How did it happen that in 2008, this unremarkable town of Amstetten gained tragic notoriety worldwide, and the surname Fritzl appeared on the front pages of European newspapers for many months? This is Phantom speaking, and today you'll learn about a horrifying crime that earned the succinct name the Amstetten Affair. Music. Josef Fritzl was a respected resident of Amstetten, perhaps a bit reclusive, but such quirks were forgiven in a man like him, for a talented specialist in electrical engineering was hard to find. Colleagues and employers spoke of him with reverence. Fritzl, even by Austrian standards, was distinguished by his meticulousness at work. He never arrived late and could devise ingenious solutions to any engineering problem. Add to that a large 3-story house, 7 children, and several properties throughout the town. In short, a true model citizen, firmly on his feet. Fritzl's children, 7 in total, were adored by teachers and neighbors alike. Always polite and courteous, diligently attending school. Of course, the family was strict. The father held unquestionable authority. But how else to keep 7 rambunctious kids in line? Strict but fair. That's how the residents of Amstetten characterized Josef Fritzl. Yet, Fritzl's own childhood could hardly be called happy. When the boy was 4 years old, his mother threw his father out of the house. The man not only ignored his duties as head of the family but caused endless troubles. In the end, the mother decided it was better to have no husband at all, and a few years later, Franz Fritzl perished in the war. As a result, young Josef grew up in absolute poverty. It got so bad that neighbors fed the boy, or he might not have survived the hungry war years. Still, Fritzl's mother worked tirelessly to keep their small family afloat. She not only toiled day and night but kept her son in iron gloves. The woman didn't miscalculate. Josef managed to get an education and found work. The talented young man was noticed, and our hero's career quickly took off. Soon, he married an 18-year-old girl named Rosemarie and set about fulfilling his main dream. Fritzl longed for a large family where he would be the authoritative and strict father. Indeed, Rosemarie later bore 7 children, as mentioned. In the family itself, Fritzl enjoyed unyielding authority. The children were forbidden from bringing guests home, from staying out too long after school. In the father's presence, no one dared address him directly or utter an extra word. But the townspeople saw nothing wrong in this. The children were Fritzl's true pride. All except his daughter Elisabeth. Several times, Elisabeth ran away from home, and it took the inconsolable father considerable effort to track down and bring back his wayward daughter. Moreover, she was sometimes seen in bars surrounded by dubious company. The residents of Amstetten shook their heads sympathetically each time the father had to set out in search of his child. Unfortunately, all of old man Fritzl's efforts were in vain. While the other children married or got wed, Elisabeth went off the rails and eventually joined some religious sect, abandoning her parents. They learned this after yet another long search. Apparently, the daughter's reckless act completely broke Josef. He no longer hoped to find Lisa and began leading an even more secluded life. To distract himself somehow, he fully devoted himself to building a bunker in the backyard. After all, the second half of the 20th century passed under the shadow of a constant nuclear conflict threat. Since Austria was dangerously close to socialist East Germany, the government allowed citizens to build bunkers in case of a nuclear strike. So, Fritzl, having obtained permission even before Elisabeth's disappearance, decided to acquire a reliable shelter in case of catastrophe. However, a few more years passed, and the Fritzl couple began discovering strange finds near their home. As it turned out, the shameless Elisabeth hadn't just abandoned her parents. She had started periodically leaving her children for them. Apparently, the sect's rules forbade its members from reproducing. Over the 24 years of Elisabeth's absence, Her parents were forced to take in and raise 3 children. Each time, a note with the child's name and a brief message to Josef and Rosemarie was attached. Despite the daughter's outrageous audacity, the Fritzls accepted the children into their family and provided the little ones with everything necessary. Neighbors were amazed by the responsible act of the newfound guardians. Lisa, Monika, and Alexander grew up, attended kindergartens and schools. There was still no word from their mother. That's roughly how the neighbors and other town residents saw the Fritzl family story. A tireless neighbor who works without rest to ensure his children's comfortable existence, and an ungrateful daughter who does nothing but dump her kids on the Fritzls' doorstep. But everything changed radically on April 19, 2008. Elisabeth left another gift for her parents, namely her now adult daughter Kerstin. The girl's condition was assessed as extremely critical. Kerstin's organs were failing. Her body was so weakened, as if the poor thing had spent years without sunlight and adequate nutrition. Also on the doorstep, the Fritzls found a note in which Elisabeth asked them to care for her daughter and promised to return within the next month. The situation was more than strange, but the doctors, true to the Hippocratic Oath, didn't ask extra questions and first rushed to save the girl's life. At the same time, everyone was struck by Josef Fritzl's behavior. Instead of staying at the hospital with his granddaughter, the man immediately left, asking the doctors not to involve the police. Meanwhile, Kerstin's condition worsened. Her body was racked by convulsions, and blood oozed from her mouth, which was almost devoid of teeth. To continue treatment, the medics needed the full picture. What caused the seizure? Had such cases occurred before? Was first aid provided? The answers to all these questions could only come from one person, Elisabeth, who, according to Fritzl, was still in an unknown sect. Since time was running out, the hospital administration decided on an unprecedented step. One of the medics recorded a video appeal to Elisabeth, urging her to come to the hospital as soon as possible where her daughter was, and to explain the situation in as much detail as possible. The appeal was broadcast on all state channels, and a miracle did happen. On April 26, 2008, Elisabeth Fritzl reappeared on the streets of Amstetten after 24 years of disappearance. However, the police were already waiting at the hospital, and the woman, along with her father who had brought her to the clinic, was taken to the station for questioning. They planned to open a criminal case against her and deprive her of parental rights. But at the mere sight of Elisabeth, the law enforcers had certain questions. Externally, the woman looked barely better than her comatose daughter. Thin, with rotten teeth and completely gray hair. Although her passport said she was 42, she looked all of 60. During the interrogation, Elisabeth confirmed her father's version about staying in a sect, but her words contained numerous inconsistencies, and her phrases sounded as if they had been memorized in advance. And then, after several hours, the woman promised to tell the whole truth, but on one condition: she must never see her father again. The policeman conducting the interrogation gave his word as an officer, and Elisabeth began her story. What was heard in the station would forever change the lives of people somehow connected to the strange affairs in Amstetten. According to Elisabeth, Josef Fritzl led a double life. A respected resident, a professional in his field, and a family man at home, he turned into a true monster. As soon as the girl started walking, her father regularly rewarded her with severe beatings for the slightest offense. The other children got it too, but it was Elisabeth whom Fritzl considered his favorite, expressing his affection in such a twisted form. The abuse didn't stop at beatings. Starting from age 11, the girl was subjected to constant sexual violence from her father, and since Fritzl controlled every step of Elisabeth's life, beating her for the slightest deviation from the established rules, no one except the criminal and the victim knew about the horrific things happening in the house on Ibstrasse 40. But time passed. Elisabeth grew up and wanted less and less to put up with the orders set by her father. Moreover, despite the psychological trauma, she became interested in peers. All her attempts to leave home were not the whims of a rebellious teenager but desperate efforts to escape the house of horrors. But each time, the supposedly caring father found Elisabeth and brought her back. In the police's opinion, the culmination of this story was a letter from her boyfriend, intercepted by Fritzl. It turned out the young people were planning an escape to create a family somewhere far away and live happily. That's when Fritzl realized that threats and beatings alone wouldn't hold Elisabeth. It was during this period that Fritzl was already finishing the bunker construction. To this day, it's unknown whether the family father truly feared a nuclear war or had originally built a prison for his own daughter. The criminal answers this question evasively, but the fact remains. One day, Fritzl asked Elisabeth to go down to the basement, supposedly to help with some task in the workshop there, and drugged his daughter. She woke up in complete darkness, chained. Even without the chain, Elisabeth couldn't have escaped anyway. The heavy bunker door was locked with an electric lock, the code to which only the criminal knew. Still, the meticulous Fritzl decided to play it safe. Elisabeth spent about 9 months on the chain. At first, the girl tried to resist. She screamed with all her might and pounded on the deaf walls of the bunker, earning more bruises. However, the room was perfectly isolated from the outside world, and not a single sound could penetrate through the thick layer of concrete and insulating materials. Upstairs, Fritzl actively spread rumors that his wayward daughter had left her native home and joined some religious sect, categorically refusing to return. To avoid being unfounded, he forced Elisabeth to write a letter and stuck stamps from a nearby town on the envelope. Fritzl carefully checked the message's content to ensure there was no hint of a plea for help. Then followed several more letters that completely lulled the vigilance of local officials and police. The town's residents could only sympathize with the exemplary family man whose daughter had treated her parents so ungratefully. The criminal negligence of the officials is even more astonishing in light of the fact that totalitarian sects are quite atypical for Austria. The whole world had heard of monstrous events where members of informal religious groups committed terrorist acts like in Japan or mass suicides like in the USA. However, in Catholic Austria, sects didn't enjoy much success. Nevertheless, none of the law enforcers bothered to even make inquiries. The country's legislation played a role too. The police aren't authorized to search for people who have already turned 18. It's considered that an adult citizen can move freely around the country. Thus, the fake letter, the police's inaction, and most importantly, Josef Fritzl's impeccable reputation simply erased the girl from life. Well, she left and left. She has every right, they thought. Soon, Elisabeth's disappearance was forgotten, and the town returned to its former measured existence. About this, Fritzl soon informed his prisoner to finally kill any hope of freedom in the girl. She had no choice but to resign herself to her unenviable fate, endure regular abuse from her father, and content herself with the meager food the jailer brought to the basement. Days dragged on, one after another, folding into months and years. Elisabeth's only entertainment was counting the hours until her tormentor's return and recalling life before her forced imprisonment. Besides physical violence, Fritzl psychologically tormented his victim. Every day, he brought his daughter news from the upper world, telling of the successes of her brothers and sisters who remained free. Curiously, almost all the Fritzl children tried to marry or get wed as soon as possible to leave the hated home where everything was subject to the tyrant father's rules. Only one son, also named Josef, wasn't allowed by his father to leave the parental home. The young man, who suffered developmental delays due to constant beatings, stayed in the house as a servant, helping his father in his work in every way. Nevertheless, Fritzl forbade anyone from descending into the bunker under threat of punishment, so even young Josef never crossed the forbidden threshold. As for Mother Rosemarie, there's no need to mention her. She probably feared her husband more than all the household members and didn't dare take a step without permission. And then one day, Elisabeth realized she was pregnant. It was the 4th year of imprisonment, and the girl's feelings were mixed. On one hand, she knew the serious problems that could arise in a child conceived by close relatives. On the other, Elisabeth clung to the hope that her father would take her to the hospital, where there might be a chance to escape or ask for help from others. But Josef Fritzl remained adamant. The girl had to give birth on her own. The only thing the father did was bring medical literature to the bunker. So, Elisabeth prepared for forced motherhood independently. On August 30th, 1988, the prisoner gave birth to a girl, Kerstin, cutting the umbilical cord herself. The lessons from medical textbooks weren't in vain. As soon as the bunker's population doubled, the question of expanding the living space arose sharply. Initially, the bunker was little more than a prison cell. However, with the child's appearance, additional space was needed, so Elisabeth had to dig the earth herself for Fritzl to equip extra rooms. As criminologists later discovered, over 24 years of captivity, Elisabeth dug out so much earth that it would require 17 trucks to haul it away. Fritzl proved to be a generous jailer, as he repeatedly claimed during the investigation. He equipped the bunker with a small bathroom to bathe Kerstin, a primitive kitchen, and even dragged in a washing machine. Of course, to some extent, the confinement conditions became more comfortable. But since the bunker had very poor ventilation, cooking smells didn't dissipate, and moisture from hygiene procedures led to rapid mold growth. Another significant drawback of the underground lair was the low ceilings, barely reaching 170 centimeters, so an adult couldn't stand up straight. Besides the lack of fresh air, the prisoner's health was severely undermined by a deficiency of vitamin D, which, as known, is produced when skin contacts sunlight. The only light source in the bunker was dim electric lamps. After Kerstin's birth, Fritzl seriously considered starting a second full-fledged family in the bunker. With intervals of 2 years, Stefan, Lisa, Monika, and Alexander came into the world. The prisoner continued to give birth independently, guided by textbooks and personal experience. But with the third child's appearance, Josef Fritzl decided to slightly alter his plans. Whether because the girl was born sickly and cried too much, or because the bunker could hold only a limited number of people, the maniac decided to get rid of the newborn. Despite the horrific phrasing, Fritzl didn't kill the child. When Lisa was 9 months old, he confronted Elisabeth with the fact the girl would grow up upstairs. What followed was the story of the foundling and the letter from the sect. Yes, Fritzl again handed his daughter paper and a pen and dictated a new message. Thus, Lisa left the bunker. The same luck smiled on 2 other children, Monika and Alexander. Fritzl obtained guardianship over the children and began receiving substantial money from the state for their upkeep. That's why investigators saw not an act of humanism in Fritzl's actions but a cunning calculation. At that time, the maniac's affairs were going poorly, and he even had to arson one of his properties to get an insurance payout. The state money helped him not only pay off debts but continue leading a quite extravagant lifestyle. After all, Fritzl was a big fan of vacations in Thailand, where, according to colleagues, he spent all his time in local brothels. In 2002, Elisabeth gave birth from her father for the last time. But since the girl had no opportunity for an ultrasound, she didn't suspect until the end that she was pregnant with twins. In the end, only one child survived, Felix. His brother, later posthumously named Michael, died 2 days later. The police later had to sort out whether the second child could have been saved if Fritzl had taken Elisabeth to the hospital in time. In that case, the maniac would face another charge: manslaughter through criminal negligence. When Fritzl descended into the basement once more and found the dead child, he took the body and coldly burned it in the garbage furnace, thereby destroying all traces of the crime. Several more years passed. The children on the surface continued living full lives, unaware that literally a few meters away, their brothers and sisters were imprisoned in a dungeon. Fritzl himself was aging. Living for 2 families was becoming harder. His fading body coped worse with the need to carry heavy bags of food to the bunker. And that's when a plan matured in the maniac's head. Fritzl decided it was time to release the prisoners. Yes, it was risky, but the father of 2 families possessed unquestionable authority and was sure that the intimidated children would support the legend of staying in a sect. This perfectly explained the prisoner's sickly appearance, as if the sect had held Elisabeth and the children in horrific conditions, and the girl had miraculously escaped. Fritzl began preparing the household for major changes in their lives. However, Kerstin's sudden illness greatly accelerated events. Despite the lack of sunlight and fresh air, the children often fell ill. Elisabeth had only aspirin and cough syrup at her disposal. And when the eldest daughter, who didn't boast iron health anyway, lost consciousness and began convulsing, Fritzl decided it was time to go to the hospital. The further story is known to us. The tormentor did take Kerstin to the hospital, but vigilant doctors did everything to get the police involved. Thus, the gruesome story of the house on Ibstrasse 40 was revealed, and the respectable resident of Amstetten, Josef Fritzl, showed his true beastly face. While the police studied the terrifying bunker and interrogated Fritzl and his prisoners, journalists from around the world flooded the town. For photographs of Elisabeth and her children, major publications promised millions. Journalists staked out the hospital walls for hours where the basement dwellers were transferred. Persistent paparazzi burrowed into the ground to fool motion sensors installed around the clinic's perimeter, set up ambushes in trees, and even fought with security and police. In the end, Austrian authorities created a blacklist of journalists who especially zealously tried to violate the victim's privacy. It's worth noting separately about Stefan and Felix, who were the last to leave the underground dungeon. The boys were taken from the basement at dusk so the sunlight wouldn't damage their eyes, accustomed to darkness over many years. For a long time afterward, they went outside in dark glasses and with sunscreen applied to their skin. In captivity, the children could communicate only with each other, their mother, and the visiting Fritzl, so their vocabulary was severely limited. Nevertheless, Elisabeth did everything possible to teach her sons German and basic reading and writing skills. Curiously, the television that Fritzl also brought to the bunker played a huge role. The blue screen became a window to the world the children had never seen before. So, upon emerging to the surface, the brothers had an idea of what cars and mobile phones looked like, knew what trees, sky, sun, and moon appeared as. The problem was that the TV showed all this in a two-dimensional plane. Therefore, Stefan and Felix soon had issues perceiving real objects. Still, Felix, who was only 5 at the time of release, showed excellent progress. Like any child, he was open to everything new and embraced his first car ride with delight. Yes, the boy still preferred moving on all fours, but proper nutrition and physical exercises, according to doctors, should help fix the situation. Things were much worse for 18-year-old Stefan. The low ceiling didn't allow the young man to stand up straight, so he was forced to hunch severely. His social skills suffered greatly too. Stefan missed the period when teenagers undergo active socialization, striving to make friends and learn to interact with each other. Doctors expressed concerns that the young man might never become a full-fledged member of society. Meanwhile, criminologists studied the underground dwelling, and officials didn't know what to marvel at more: Fritzl's cruelty and cunning or the ingenuity with which he equipped the bunker. The entrance to the underworld, carefully hidden in the workshop, was blocked by a massive reinforced concrete door. During the search, it took several strong men to move it. The clever Fritzl had equipped the door with a special mechanism and could easily open and close the massive structure. It's terrifying to imagine what fate awaited the prisoners if something happened to their tormentor. The mother and children would be doomed to starvation, and no one would ever find their bodies. Although Fritzl himself swore that in such a case, he always set a timer that would open the door after some time, investigators found nothing of the sort. Behind the door, officers found a narrow corridor that sequentially led to a conditional kitchen, then a bathroom, and ended in 2 tiny bedrooms. However, the investigators, try as they might, couldn't stay in the bunker for more than an hour. The stale air, lack of oxygen, and confined space took their toll, so law enforcers periodically relieved each other. It's horrifying to imagine what Elisabeth endured, spending 24 years in inhuman conditions. And in Austrian society, unpleasant discussions resumed. Not long ago, the whole country was shocked by another basement case. The story of Natascha Kampusch, whom a maniac held in a house for over 8 years. And now an even more appalling case. Some even called Austria the country of basements, wondering how many more people might be underground. When the story became public, journalists managed to find mentions in newspaper archives that our hero had been convicted of rape and even served a prison term. Why wasn't this known earlier? Here we run into the letter of Austrian law. All criminal cases in the country are destroyed after 10 years. This is considered both part of the rehabilitation program and the realization of the right to privacy. Moreover, testimonies from people who at different times rented rooms in the ill-fated house began surfacing. After all, renting out housing was one of Fritzl's income sources. Yes, in that very house, people rented rooms. Tenants recalled that Fritzl indeed regularly carried things to the basement, and at night, quiet knocks came from below. Moreover, although the police are sure the maniac had no accomplices, One bunker mystery remains unsolved. Fritzl was good at electrics, but laying plumbing in the bunker caused him difficulties. So he turned to a plumber who did the job and left. This person's identity remains unknown to this day. It's worth noting that initially, the police suspected Rosemarie, Fritzl's wife, too. However, there was no evidence against her. It's impossible to say for sure whether she knew everything or not. Of course, one should blame Fritzl. Raised by a strict mother, the criminal likely harbored eternal resentment toward humanity and dreamed only of absolute power. When the children began gradually leaving the parental home, he decided to resolve the situation in a completely twisted way. Create a new family over which his power would be absolute. For this purpose, the underground prison was built, where Fritzl became not just the family father but practically a god. For the unfortunate prisoners' lives directly depended on his visits. Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment. The criminal was charged not only with rape and enslavement but also manslaughter through negligence. Fritzl is in prison under constant surveillance. Too many inmates want to take justice into their own hands against the maniac. At the same time, it's noted that he receives sympathetic letters from some women. They see him primarily as a confused person who only wanted to protect his daughter from alcohol and forbidden substances. However, whether they themselves would want to be in Elisabeth's place, history is silent. Meanwhile, the basement children are not only undergoing rehabilitation, but also spending time with their brothers and sisters who grew up on the surface. By Austrian laws and due to excessive media interest, the Fritzl victims receive documents with new names, and their location is carefully hidden from outsiders. Will a new name and a new home help at least partially forget the years spent in the basement under inhuman conditions? It's unknown, but let's hope that the further life of Elisabeth and her children unfolds in the best possible way.